Ani, manado makwa kwe indigena kaz, mangan nito tem, koti kwogang nidunjiba. Hello, my name is Spirit Bear Woman. I am from the Wolf Clan and I come from London, Ontario at the Forks of Antler River. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that this presentation was created on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, Wyandot, and Adirondack peoples. The purpose of this presentation is to familiarize you with the core concepts of participatory research and how participatory methodologies apply to research with autistic people. First, I will briefly explain what participatory research is. Second, I will explain why these methodologies are important and why it is important that autistic people have a voice in the research process. I will then discuss different stages of participatory research, from research design to reflecting on results. For each stage, I will point out strategies for ensuring that the research process is accessible and empowering for all involved. Finally, I will discuss some of the ethical and practical challenges that may arise during the research process. What is participatory research? Before we apply participatory research methodologies to autism studies, it is important to have an understanding of what they are and how they developed. Participatory research describes a group of similar methodologies that aim to increase community involvement in research. Methodologies are the overarching philosophies that guide research. The methodology that the research team subscribes to will influence what questions they ask, what methods they use, and how they interpret data. These are distinct from methods, which are the specific tools that researchers use to collect data. For example, a social science researcher engaging with a more conventional research methodology might use semi-structured interviews. A researcher engaging with participatory methodology might use the same methods, but their research will be guided by their methodology. They will view their participants as active partners, and they might adapt their approach based on the input of participants. Examples of participatory methodologies include models such as participatory action research, participatory intervention research, participatory rule appraisal, development leadership teams in action, theater for development, and community-based participatory research. Different iterations of these methodologies have been in existence since at least the 1940s. They originally developed in response to failures of interventions that did not take local knowledge and context into account. Throughout the 1990s, participatory research saw significant increases in acceptance and popularity, and researchers began to see the methodology's usefulness in addressing health disparities with minority populations in both lower income and richer countries. In particular, these methodologies have popularity in Indigenous research and in mental health research because of their focus on self-determination and its potential for addressing misrepresentations of marginalized groups. A core part of participatory research is the acknowledgement of power imbalances that exist between researchers and participants, and an attempt to shift power back to participants, putting them in control of key aspects of the research process. This is intended to result in research that is more relevant to participants and their communities, and more likely to be beneficial to them. The extent to which this power is shifted differs between different participatory approaches. A common model of participation is to conceptualize it as a linear continuum or as rungs on a ladder. Sherry Arnstein and Stephen Biggs are two authors who were influential in developing this concept. Arnstein conceptualized the ladder as being divided into three sections, the lowest section being non-participation, the middle section being degrees of tokenism, and the highest section being degrees of citizen power. Participatory research is concerned with the highest section, with citizen control of research representing the highest rung on the ladder. Similarly, Biggs describes four modes of participation: contract mode, consultative mode, collaborative mode, and finally, the collegial mode. The collegial mode provides the most opportunity for participation as it focuses on building capacity within local communities, familiarizing local people with research methodologies and practices. Why are participatory methodologies needed in autism research? Until recently, there has been very little attempt in autism research to include autistic perspectives, and even less attempt to engage autistic people in setting research priorities. This has meant that autistic people have generally been relegated to the lower rungs of the ladder of participation. The exclusion of autistic perspectives has meant that research which does get funded often does not align with the priorities of the participants upon whose contributions that research is built. This creates both ethical and practical issues. From an ethical standpoint, there is the question of who research is intended to benefit. If autistic people are not included in setting research priorities, their interests are less likely to be represented in the final results. This creates research which is dependent on autistic bodies and experience for its data, but which is not accountable to provide tangible benefits to autistic people themselves. Unequal dynamics like this have created a distrust of researchers among some autistic people. This can decrease people's willingness to participate in research, leading to smaller pools of participants, and this may in turn mean that those who do participate in research are not representative of the diversity and perspectives within the autistic community as a whole. This has serious implications for the validity of research. Autistic activists have been critical of research that they perceive as being linked to eugenics, and its focus on finding the underlying causes of autism and on the prevention of the disability. This type of research often receives a disproportionate amount of funding to the exclusion of projects that focus on improving accessibility and quality of life for autistic people. Autistic activists have also been critical of research that they perceive as supporting harmful interventions such as the reduction of stimming. In their 2016 blog post, "Don't Ever Assume Autism Researchers Know What They're Doing," Mel Beggs describes the potential for researchers to fall into the trap of confirmation bias. Other autistic and non-autistic academics have highlighted this, criticizing research that reinforces negative stereotypes or which reifies gender biases of earlier research which only included male participants. Damian Milton is an autistic academic who has also made strong arguments in favor of the inclusion of autistic perspectives in research. His work has been influential in presenting a new perspective on the social difficulties experienced by autistic people. Rather than assuming that the cause of social miscommunication is in some innate deficit that autistic people have, he proposes that these miscommunications are the result of neurotypical people and autistic people having mutual difficulties understanding the other group's experiences and ways of being. He names this the double empathy problem. The takeaway from all of this is that a lack of diversity on the part of researchers limits the perspectives that a research team has to bring to the table when they are analyzing data. This can negatively impact the validity of research by creating a situation where researchers with homogeneous perspectives may end up reinforcing their own confirmation biases. Participatory research has the potential to disrupt this confirmation bias by bringing researchers into dialogue with a greater diversity of perspectives. Having this diversity allows researchers more opportunity to confront their own assumptions and glean insights that they might otherwise miss. This produces higher quality research that avoids reifying existing stereotypes about autistic people. This is important because stereotypes have real-world consequences. They contribute to stigmatization and exclusion in society, as well as contributing to employment and health disparities. How can we practice participatory research? In this section, I will take you through the steps of participatory research. These steps are guidelines, and as you can see, they are shown in this diagram, arranged in a circle. It is possible that as you work through your own participatory research projects, you will find yourself circling back to previous steps rather than following a straightforward, linear path. This is part of the research process. It is important to learn, reevaluate, and adapt as you gain more knowledge. Research design. With the focus in participatory research being on addressing power imbalances, it is important that researchers approach new projects with a sense of humility. They need to have an understanding of local contexts and priorities. This begins with listening to participants. Rather than starting with a predetermined research question, many participatory research methodologies include members of the community in research design. Research is then planned from the bottom up, designing studies in response to questions or issues raised by community members. Relationships are key to making this successful. Everyone will bring a different set of skills, experience, and expertise to the table. Taking the time to get to know participants can help researchers gauge what participants' capabilities and areas of expertise are, and avoid either putting participants in roles that they feel unequipped for, or coming across as condescending by underestimating the participants' knowledge. All of this means that participatory research projects often take more time than conventional research, and researchers may continue working with communities on multiple projects. Other considerations when designing a research project include ensuring that the methods you use to collect data are accessible and meaningful to your participants, and ensuring that you have enough time to complete your research, and that the locations where you will be conducting research are accessible. When it comes to ensuring the accessibility of your research locations, it is a good idea to visit them beforehand whenever possible, and to research how accessible they are by public transport. To ensure the accessibility of your research instruments, it can be a good idea to pilot them before you use them with a larger group of people. This can help you refine your instruments and ensure that the data you collect with them actually answers the questions that you think they are asking. As an example of an instrument that may not be getting at what the researchers intend, some of you may be familiar with these images. They come from Simon Baron-Cohen's Reading the Mind in the Eyes test. This test has been critiqued extensively by autistic activists and academics for contributing to stereotypes of autistic people as unempathetic. A good example of one such critique is the blog post by Mel Beggs that I mentioned earlier. The eyes given in this test are static photographs of actors and not images of people experiencing real emotion in real time. As such, they don't include a lot of the contextual clues that take place in real social situations, such as micro-expressions involving other parts of the face. It is not surprising then that autistic people, many of whom find eye contact uncomfortable, might be more likely to score lower on this test. The problem comes when the results of the test are taken to represent a deficit in autistic people's general ability to conceptualize other people as having their own minds. If autistic people had been included in designing this instrument, they may have pointed out potential shortcomings, that the test makes no attempt to question whether non-autistic people are just as impaired when it comes to reading autistic people's emotions. The inclusion of more diverse perspectives in the design process can help researchers refine their instruments, and it can lead researchers to research questions that they never would have thought to ask. When designing a study, it is a good idea to give yourself extra time to complete tasks whenever possible. Because of the nature of participatory research, you may end up needing this time to adjust to unexpected occurrences, respond to feedback from participants, or to persuade reluctant funding and regulatory bodies that are unused to accommodating this type of research. Above all, it is vital that researchers follow through on the commitments that they make to participants. When designing your research, you should be transparent about what you are able to accomplish and what you don't have the capacity for. Work on designing a study that is meaningful, but which you will be able to accomplish within the time constraints and resources that you have. You won't be able to answer every conceivable research question that your participants may have, and you may not have the resources and influence to affect the kinds of changes that your participants might hope for. Focus on concrete steps that you can take. Data collection. Because participatory research aims to be responsible to local contexts, there can be quite a bit of flexibility in the methods that are used to collect data. Quantitative research methods, such as surveys, may be used alongside more qualitative methods such as focus groups. However, Because participatory research is grounded in the belief that local people have meaningful expertise that is rooted in their lived experience, and because it aims to understand the perspectives of participants on their own terms, qualitative methods are often preferred. Many researchers opt to use methodologies that were developed in the disciplines of anthropology and sociology. These may include methods such as participant observation, oral histories, and semi-structured interviews. When working with autistic people, research instruments may need to be altered. For example, you may need to adapt interview schedules to ensure that you are asking more direct questions, or provide alternative formats for responses, such as text or talking mats. It can also be helpful to provide participants with more information about what to expect by providing written outlines or photos of locations. It is good practice to ask participants what accommodations they need and include them in the process of designing strategies to make your research accessible. One of the benefits of using participatory methodologies is the ability to incorporate unconventional methods that may be more accessible to participants, including those with communication barriers. These can include things like art, storytelling, photography, and concept maps. Some of these methods may be better than conventional methods at uncovering underlying structures and motivations and getting at participants' own experiences. Data analysis. In participatory research, it is important to involve participants in all parts of the research process. This includes the analysis of your data. The inclusion of participants in analysis can enable more holistic interpretations. Participants may have insights and knowledge that researchers lack. They may be able to contextualize the data and make connections that researchers would not know to make. This can improve the accuracy of your research findings. Some researchers may have concerns that this might also negatively impact the analysis by opening it up to bias. However, participatory methodologies are grounded in the understanding that observers always interpret what they observe through their own values and beliefs. This includes researchers. One way to counter potential biases is through triangulation. Triangulation is the inclusion of multiple sources of data and multiple perspectives. This way, researchers can see where different perspectives come together and where they diverge. It is important that researchers look at both. Where different lines of evidence converge, they can corroborate each other and lend validity to the findings. Places where different perspectives are contradictory may indicate a need for further investigation. Why do the perspectives contradict? A diversity of perspectives in the analysis process can lead to more complex and nuanced examination of findings. A common way to analyze qualitative data is through thematic analysis. Another presentation in this series will go into more depth about how thematic analysis is done. In this form of analysis, the researchers examine texts. For example, transcripts of interviews, social media posts, or field notes. They then highlight themes that they see reoccurring in the texts, and they look for connections and patterns between the themes. There are several software programs that may be used to assist this type of analysis, or researchers may simply use analog methods, such as highlighters or arranging snippets of the transcripts on a large table. Knowledge translation. Participatory research aims to present findings in a way that is accessible to participants and their communities. This means presenting findings in the participants' own language and using symbols and formats that are meaningful to them. This is another area where visual methods may be beneficial in communicating the results in an accessible manner. It also may mean that researchers need to publish results in alternative formats. For example, they may produce a book aimed at a non-academic audience, or publish a website or a blog. This can mean that the results of participatory research have a broader reach than those of studies whose results are only published in academic journals. Members of the public may not be able to access academic journals due to paywalls or because of the use of academic jargon. Action. Some participatory research approaches differ from more conventional methodologies in their emphasis on action and laying the groundwork for social change. These methodologies aim to generate knowledge, that leads to a better understanding of social systems in order to empower participants to make changes that benefit their communities. Action and social change can be accomplished both in how the project itself is implemented and in how communities use the knowledge generated by the project. Involving community members in the research process can create opportunities for them to build their knowledge and capacity. In this way, the research process can be an end that benefits the community in and of itself. Researchers might also work with communities to produce specific deliverables. This may include things like reports or recommendations for policy changes, or it may include publications of participants' narratives that contribute to community history and awareness. Reflection on results. It is important that researchers engaging in participatory research remain reflexive at all points of the research process. Once a study is complete, it is important to take stock, consider what you have learned and how your research process might be improved in the future. Due to the collaborative nature of participatory research, it is not uncommon for researchers to maintain long-term relationships with some participants. This can be beneficial when designing future projects with the same community. This reflexivity and ongoing relationships can also increase participants' satisfaction with research and increase their engagement. In a 2011 study, Pelicano, Dinsmore, and Charman found that participant satisfaction with research was linked to the attitudes of researchers. Participants were more likely to view research positively if they felt that researchers respected their experience and expertise and showed genuine interest in listening to their perspectives. How can we conduct research that is ethical? While participatory research aims to produce research that is less exploitative and more responsive to participants' needs and values, it is not a magical solution to all ethical challenges that may arise. Simply including participants' perspectives in research will not eliminate all power differences that could lead to exploitation or potential harm. Therefore, researchers still need to be sensitive to power relationships and be careful to obtain informed consent from all participants. Researchers also need to be mindful of the potential impact that the results of their research might have on participants and their communities. Working with autistic communities can present some unique ethical considerations. An issue that is likely to be raised by many review boards is the capacity of participants to consent. It is important not to make blanket assumptions about autistic people's ability to consent. Denying people the right to participate in research simply because they are autistic is unethical. It denies them agency and a voice in research. At the same time, it is important to account for barriers that may increase some participants' vulnerability to coercion. It is important to make accommodations for communication differences in order to make sure that participants comprehend what is involved in research and what the risks and benefits of participation are. In situations where participants do have cognitive impairments that prevent them from giving formal consent, researchers may need to seek formal consent from an authorized third party. In these cases, it is still vitally important that researchers respect the participants' autonomy and that they seek the participants' assent to research. Another significant ethical consideration when working with autistic populations is the issue of representation. Authors such as Anne McGuire and Melanie Yergo have examined how negative representations of autistic people can have real-world consequences. This brings us to the question of who is qualified to represent the autistic community. There is a great deal of diversity in autistic people's abilities, experiences, backgrounds, and perspectives. Researchers need to be aware of this when they are designing research and recruiting participants. It is good to ask yourself, whose voices are more likely to receive a platform and whose voices get ignored? Who is participating in this study? Are there segments of the population who are being left out? And what implications does that have for the results of the study? It is particularly important for researchers to consider how social factors impact access to diagnosis. Limiting a study only to people who are formally diagnosed will have the effect of limiting the participation of groups who don't have access to formal diagnosis. This may mean that women, non-binary people, people with complex needs, and people of color are less adequately represented. Any act of representation will necessarily lead to simplifying the complexity of real life. It is okay for a study to not be fully representative of the autistic population as a whole, but it is important to be aware of the study's limitations and not to generalize your results beyond what can be supported by your data. Finally, researchers need to be aware of issues surrounding credit and compensation. Studies based in the medical model of disability often assume that the anonymity of participants is paramount because they assume that disability is automatically a negative and stigmatized experience. However, there are several reasons why autistic participants may wish for their names to be attached to research findings. The most ethical approach is to allow individual participants to decide whether or not they want their name to be published. Autistic people are not often given credit for their expertise, and disabled people's labor in general tends to be undervalued. Having names attached to their contributions can be a way for participants to highlight the value of their contributions and combat stigma by demonstrating that being identified as autistic is not something that one needs to be ashamed of. In projects where participants are actively involved as co-researchers and co-authors, they should receive equal credit for their work as non-disabled team members. For similar reasons, it is important to compensate your participants in some way for their time and work. This shows that you value their contributions, and on a practical level, it can make it easier for participants to commit to engaging in the research process by offsetting costs associated with time and travel. This is particularly important when working with communities who may experience poverty at disproportionate rates. This brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening, and best of luck as you venture into the world of participatory research.